In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Last time we were together, we spoke about the powers of the soul, the inner person in the Orthodox tradition. And this evening I would like to speak about healing the soul through the grace of God and asceticism. Last time I mentioned that the inner person has been fragmented by sin and by death. Both sin and death have wounded not only the inner person, actually, we're speaking about the inner person, but have wounded the entire person as a psychosomatic unity. But speaking about the inner person specifically, we said before that the nous, if you remember that word from before that I said is very difficult to translate into English, usually translated as intellect or spiritual intellect, and occasionally also as mind. The nous, through sin and death, was weakened. The cognitive faculty became more dominant and more or less took over. The logos, or part of the logos faculty. And the natural energies that we were all given, that are God-given and come from creation, were changed into passions, which of course is not a positive change. The passions result in addictions. In fact, one way to understand the passions is to see them as addictions. The earliest discussion that I am aware of in psychology, broadly speaking, about addiction comes from the fathers of the church. And there is actually a term in Greek that is used which means exactly that, which means addiction. Addiction in this case, in the modern situation, we use a little bit more broadly because we refer most of the time to chemical addictions. But the fathers spoke of passions as addictions, which indeed they are. And as with every addiction, the passion needs to be challenged. Asceticism itself, as a word, doesn't find its origins historically in the Christian tradition, because you can find the word ascesis, asceticism, in Greek literature before Christianity. And ascesis, or asceticism, is simply spiritual exercise. Ascesis in our tradition is spiritual exercise. Ascesis could have been a word used to describe what athletes did in ancient Greece when they were training. So its meaning was a kind of exercise. But my own personal favorite definition of asceticism comes from the writer Evagrios, who is not regarded as a father in the Orthodox tradition because of his rather eccentric understanding of cosmology, but who is a very, very great spiritual master and a very, very insightful spiritual writer. And Evagrios says, very simply, ascesis consists in keeping the commandments. And so if you had a very simple way to describe asceticism, this is it. People ask, where can I find asceticism discussed in the New Testament? Well, actually, you can find it in St. Peter's epistles, rather clearly described, but broadly speaking, in the New Testament, asceticism is simply the keeping of the commandments of Christ. So for someone who's not familiar with the term, you might refer them back to the New Testament and simply say it is the keeping of the commandments. It's, I think, the most essential definition of asceticism, of Christian asceticism, that is. And indeed, the commandments of Christ challenge the passions when you do them, when you keep them. You don't challenge the passions when you talk about the commandments of Christ. You challenge the passions when you keep the commandments of Christ and when you do them. The commandments of Christ cause the passions with time and through the grace of God to be reordered or rehabilitated. This evening I just wanted to speak very, very briefly, it's sort of a very quick overview about several expressions of asceticism, 9 actually, that we are familiar with in Orthodox spiritual practice and in the Christian tradition in general, and talk about how these expressions or forms of asceticism are used as a therapy for the passions. And of course, if you were to ask someone about ascesis, asceticism, likely the first form of asceticism that that person would think of would be fasting. So let's talk for a moment about fasting. Fasting means, the way we usually use the word, it means either reducing the food intake or abstaining from certain foods. We say that during Lent we fast. More precisely, when you read the Fathers, that particular practice is not actually called fasting, it's called moderation. It means reducing the intake of food or not eating certain foods like meat or dairy products. Fasting in Holy Scripture actually means not eating. And very importantly, it means a practice that includes prayer. The scriptural fasting is never a diet. Scriptural fasting is a form of prayer, and the fasting undergirds the prayer so that we get the order right and understand what makes Christian fasting Christian. Because lots of people in the world diet, and you don't need to be a Christian to be a vegetarian or to eat less. And so there's something about the practice which is unique to Christianity, and this is it. Now, how can fasting, when coupled with prayer, challenge the passions? And you might also be interested in knowing which passions in general fasting might help cure. Well, we'll start with the very obvious, gluttony. Obviously, fasting could be very useful to challenge gluttony because it challenges it rather directly. Gluttony, broadly speaking, however, can involve not only food but drink. I suppose in a general sense it could involve other things as well. We can be gluttonous in our use of entertainment, for example. I like the definition used by Paul Yevdokimov, a well-known 20th century Russian Orthodox theologian, who said that through fasting we rediscover a virginal use of food. A virginal use of food. And so fasting also actually challenges lust directly. Not just gluttony in all of its expressions, but it challenges lust and indeed any strong, passionate desire. We have a number of passions that afflict the appetitive aspect of the inner person, the part of the powers of the soul that have to do with desire and appetite. And in general, fasting is very, very important for that whole set, if I can put it that way, of powers of the soul, to cure them. Let me just speak about lust for a moment, because lust is a perversion of an original natural energy. It's hard to see that, unfortunately, because lust is such a perverse form of that natural energy that it's rather difficult to imagine what the original form might have looked like. But the original form, the original natural energy, is desire, eros, in its good and proper sense. Desire, eros, becomes lust when it is affected by sin and by death. And so lust needs to be challenged initially, and then it needs to be rehabilitated, purified, cured, so that it can gradually re-emerge as desire, as longing. Eros can also be translated as a longing for someone, for a real person. A lust, by the way, doesn't need a person. It can do well with an image or a non-person. And it's soul-destroying precisely because it wrecks relationships. So that's fasting. There's a lot of discussion about fasting in spiritual literature. The next one you might not have thought of right away as a form of asceticism, but it's definitely discussed. Almsgiving. Almsgiving, yes, exactly. The giving of money to the poor is a form of asceticism. And the fathers talk about it as being therapeutic, curative. I suppose as soon as you hear that, you would think, well, the obvious passion that this would be good to cure would be avarice, love of money. And indeed, it does a great job on that. However, you might be very interested to hear, that almsgiving was used by the fathers to cure anger. And maybe you would think to yourself, what is the relationship? Well, you see, anger is connected to self-love most of the time. And when you love money, you're loving yourself. When you're giving money away, especially beyond the amount that you might have anticipated giving away, you are directly challenging self-love. Evagrios actually puts it rather strongly. He says, charity and money do not coexist. That's a strong statement, isn't it? We would have to unpack it properly in our own situation, but you can certainly see what he's getting at. Yes, I know he wrote for a monastic audience, and monks, of course, have a vow of poverty. But there's a way in which we can understand that, those of us who have not taken a vow of poverty as well. Almsgiving reestablishes a connection with mercy and compassion, reconnects the soul with that. And so it's very important. Almsgiving is a very purifying form of asceticism. Psalmody, thirdly, the singing, the chanting of the Psalms. Well, you might find that rather intriguing. Of course, monastics do a whole lot of it. That's the core of monastic worship, collective monastic worship, is corporate worship, is the chanting of the Psalms. What passions might the chanting of the Psalms or the reading of the Psalms cure? Well, many places in the Fathers of the Church we read that the reading or the chanting of the Psalms purifies and heals the heart in general. But it is listed in the Fathers as being specifically a form of asceticism to cure anger. The chanting of the Psalms cures specifically very strong anger, which is a very difficult passion because anger is one of the passions that unlocks a whole set of other passions. Anger never occurs as a lonely passion. Anger always occurs as a passion that opens up a whole constellation of other passions. We're all aware of that. You didn't need me to tell you that anger opens up a lot of other passions and is the source of a lot of sin. And so it needs to be cured. Yes, it's possible for anger to be a natural energy. We see this when the Lord expels the money changers from the temple. There's no question about the fact that he is using that particular power of the soul, anger. But in the Lord, it's according to nature, kataphysin. For us, in our experience of anger, anger is not pure. Anger is not according to nature. It's usually more often than not, but not always. There are different reasons why people are angry. And sometimes it's very important for people to work through it to discover what the cause might be. But a lot of time it is connected to self-love. Psalmody is a very important way to cure it. Silence. Silence is a form of asceticism, not talking. To put it really bluntly, not talking. Not talking is not really silence yet, but I'll tell you something which is hardly a secret. You can't get to silence if you keep talking. So you have to discover the initial expression of silence, which is not talking, to get to real silence, which is deeper than simply not talking. What passion might silence or not talking, its initial expression, cure? Well, not surprisingly, talkativeness, but also pride and judgment of others. You think about it, a judgmental person is never silent. Once a person judges another, the whole point the person feels is to say it. They've just got to say it. They're no longer fully in control because it's an addiction. But it starts, of course, with our permission. If we're going to judge another person, it is going to become a thought which is going to be very difficult to resist. So we're going to tell the person we're judging, or we're going to tell somebody else, and that just inflames the passion all the more. And people say, how can I stop judging? What can I do? I have no idea how I can do that. Stop talking. Stop talking. It's a very, not so easy, but challenging and simple fix. Don't talk. Then the passion feels cut off. You have an angry passion. You have a passion shaking you saying, what's the point of judging someone if I can't talk about it? Exactly. What is the point of judging someone? What is exactly the point of judging another person? It's a sin. And when you can't talk, the frustrated sin realizes, well, there isn't a point to judging anyone else. Where's the fun in judging someone else if you can't talk about it? The person feels. So, it's curative. It's the first therapy. You can, of course, judge a person in your heart and stay quiet, but it's probably not going to stay around for that much longer. It will begin to be cured. A judgmental person is rarely silent. Next, the reading of the lives of the Holy Fathers. It's given to us as a form of asceticism. Who's it good for? Well, it's good for everybody. But it's used specifically as a way to cure pride and spiritual delusion, what is called in Slavonic languages prelest. This plani in Greek. There is a cure for this. The cure is the grace of God, of course. But the fathers say when you read the ascetic feats of the great fathers, the first thing you're struck by is you can't do this. You're reading precisely the stories of people who are doing things you're not doing. Sometimes they even become virtually mythical figures for people who think, could they really have done these things? Because they seem so far beyond us. When we realize that they really did do these things and do these things, there are still people who do these things, it's very instructive for us. We realize we are not so spiritually great, and it's a good cure for spiritual delusion, prelest, and pride in general. When we read the stories of the great fathers, of the desert fathers, desert mothers, and when we practice remembrance of our sins without being depressed. Remembrance of sin without being depressed. So you read the works of the fathers, you realize that, well, maybe we aren't terribly ascetical in comparison, which of course is the obvious truth, and with a certain remembrance of our own sins, it opens the heart to receive humility, and humility is the first virtue. Next, reading vigils and prayer. Here I'm referring to abstention from sleep. Well, there are lots of people who are sleep deprived. I think a lot of us can identify with it as a phenomenon, but it doesn't mean we're practicing asceticism. Here, this is an intentional act in order to pray, not to abstain from sleep to watch TV or to be entertained. That's not asceticism. That's something that, in fact, inflames the passions. But to abstain from sleep to pray at night. You know that monastics love to pray at night. There's something quite angelic about it that we all feel at least once a year in the Orthodox Church on Pascha. Of course, it's a great feast of victory. We're feeling the power of the feast of the Christ resurrected. But we're feeling that there's something very special about being completely alive to God when the world is asleep. The world is asleep and the church is at prayer, alive to God. That can be something that is practiced not just on great feasts, but on a regular basis. What would it cure? Inattention. Our nous is wandering, it's diffuse. Because it's wounded and darkened, it doesn't want to stay at home in the heart. It wants to go out for adventures and try different things. And it needs to be healed. We need to develop attentiveness, nipsis, vigilance. And that doesn't come easily, but it does come through going to services, reading, doing the prayers, and staying up sometimes to do them, with the blessing of your spiritual father, please, so that it doesn't make you crabby the rest of the week. I'm just noting that I'm not telling you to run out and do all of these things right away, because they need to be done in a certain order and in a certain way and in a certain context, or you won't find benefit from them, really. In fact, sometimes for people who aren't ready for certain forms of asceticism, it just makes them embittered, makes them upset. Another expression of asceticism, discipline of the body. Discipline of the body without wounding the body. For example, being at a long service and standing in one spot. That's a form of asceticism. It's a very basic, very simple form. That increases attention because the body is still and when the body is still for a long period of time, there is a certain impact on the soul with time, when there's a consistent practice of this. Sometimes we are disciplining the body by doing prostrations, not just during Lent, of course, when we're reading the prayer of St. Ephrem the Syrian, but in general we can incorporate. It's perhaps easier for people who are younger and whose backs are in better shape, but in general, doing something with the body, praying with the body, disciplining the body is a very important form of asceticism, precisely because we are psychosomatic beings. So we pray with the body. We don't just think the sign of the cross, we make the sign of the cross. We don't just think about a prayerful posture, we assume a prayerful posture. We make prostrations. And this again can challenge passions of desire, lust, impurity of heart, but also pride, and as I mentioned, inattention. Coming to the end of the list that I chose for tonight, I called this particular expression of asceticism rapid forgiveness. The practice of forgiving quickly actually is linked to something in the Orthodox tradition we call apathia, dispassion, or passionlessness, dispassion. And apathia, bezstrastia in Slavonic languages, is a whole particular state that expresses peace of soul and spiritual maturity. And indeed, when rapid forgiveness, as I call it, becomes a real grace, it is an expression of apathia. But you know, it has to begin somewhere. You don't just simply reach apathia by reading about it and praying that God will give it to you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. You have to start forgiving people faster than you would have before. It means challenging your own emotions, because really, at a certain point, we feel a right to be upset, and we feel we have a right, not simply a privilege, a right to withhold forgiveness. Once we tell ourselves we have no such right, the Lord doesn't say anywhere that He gives us a right to withhold forgiveness. And so forgiveness needs to be practiced naturally, hopefully, but also quickly. So I didn't know whether to call this really a virtue, because strictly speaking, as I said, it's an expression of apathia. It's not simply an expression of asceticism, but here's the thing. It's an expression of apathia that begins with an ascetic expression. So it begins somewhere. It begins by forgiving more quickly. When you see this exercised as a grace, not only as an ascetic discipline, it's one of the most stunning expressions of the spiritual life. You know, when we forgive our enemies, and there are many instances of Christians doing this and converting people. Certainly I was very impressed by it in the lives of a number of Romanian fathers who, after the Second World War, were imprisoned in a very brutal prison in Romania, where they experienced horrific forms of torture that no one should really even know about because it was so demonic. These fathers, and I knew some of them, forgave with a power that is absolutely heavenly. And they kept that grace. I remember seeing it in one particular father for whom I have very great veneration. It's absolutely stunning. And they're able to do this and keep this and grow in this, and it became became a grace which they exercised in their old age, but they had to learn it through a brutal form of asceticism, not one that you and I would ever want to know about. It's a grace, it's a virtue. When we practice it at our level, it addresses pride, judgmentalism, and self-righteous, pseudo-religious behavior. And we have a lovely word for that in the Orthodox tradition, Pharisaism. It's a good time of year to talk about what Pharisaism is, because we have the gospel teaching us right before Lent begins. It's certainly something that we need to address. Finally, rejection of thoughts in order to pray. It's not simply that we fight with thoughts as a mental exercise, but it's a form of asceticism when we don't indulge a thought. We, under most circumstances, are not responsible for the appearance of a particular thought. We become responsible on the level of either greeting the thought and welcoming it, or cutting off all contact with it and making it an unwelcome guest. And that's what we need to do. And it's a form of asceticism because we like certain thoughts, and we like to repeat them, and we like to fantasize, and that wounds the nous and even more so that it becomes captured by those thoughts. The nous becomes a prisoner that is dragged around in chains by passions and thoughts, led around as a slave. When the nous was meant as a faculty with which we can see God, that's what we're supposed to be doing with it. And so the rejection of particular thoughts, or at least the refusal to couple with them, so that we can have pure prayer, is a very important expression of asceticism. I think it addresses every single passion that exists. There isn't a passion that doesn't express itself as a thought. And when that thought is rejected, then certainly we can begin to experience the freedom that comes from not becoming the thought slave. And most importantly, we can really pray. Because a person who's consumed with the passions does not pray well. There are all kinds of books out on prayer, lots of people complaining that prayer is difficult, which of course is true. Prayer is very difficult and hard work. But a lot of it is because when we begin to pray, the passions become more obvious to us, and we don't know how to fight them. Let's put it out there so that people understand. An angry person does not pray. How would you expect an angry person to have pure prayer? It's not possible. And so when these passions are not addressed, and the person is complaining as if it were God's fault or the church's fault, I find liturgy boring. Well, whose problem is that? The people who wrote the prayers were not bored by them. And that's not because they lived in another century. That's because they were not boring people. People who are consumed by the passions are boring. And I'll tell you why we are boring, all of us, when we have the passions. Because it's all the same. It's all the same. Your passions, my passions. What's the difference? It's all boring. And none of it contributes to our healing. But a person who's free of passions has a real free character. They're intensely interesting, natural, humorous, present to you, so on and so forth. But that's for another time, another discussion. Just to sum up for this evening, I want to mention a few basic points. Prayer is more than an ascetic discipline, but prayer needs asceticism and the grace of God in order to be free. As I mentioned, anger, pride, judgment of others, all of these passions hinder prayer. Asceticism itself does not heal. The grace of God does, but asceticism increases our availability to God and our receptivity to God's grace, so we need it. Asceticism, as I mentioned, challenges our passions. Asceticism, with the grace of God, can break addictions. But for the passions to be rehabilitated and for the natural energies, original natural energies, to reemerge, asceticism alone is not sufficient. The fathers of the Church are very clear. We need the mysteria. We need the sacraments. And that will be the topic that we will talk about in 2 weeks.